He only played in 12 games last year. But the real big difference between last year and any of his previous seasons is the sack total. She says it a little bit differently. She's like, well, I've seen something, but I don't really know if it was a little girl or it was whatever it was. So
hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is episode 12 of Player Normal Activity. I'm your host, Kraig. Thank you for joining me once again. And today we have a special guest, part of the Roto Heat family, one of the originals himself. We have Brad Menendez. You may know him as Roto Heat Brad. He is the director of video content and a senior content creator that specializes in video, IDP, and Devi content for rotoheat.com. You can find him doing videos, all sorts, over on Roto Heat YouTube. You can find his articles at Roto Heat, and you can also find him on the Facebook page and Discord. Brad, thanks for joining me today.
it is an honor, as always, to talk with the greatest mind in player normal activity. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I should also mention a peek behind the curtain. Brad is also the main editor for this wonderful series. So if you enjoy the editing, you have Brad to thank for making me look even better. Well, maybe not look better, but sound better than I normally would.
You look good on your own as it is. I don't need to do anything there.
Well, everyone, you know the format of the show by now. I don't have to go over that, but I will anyway. We're going to be talking about a player first and then going into our paranormal section of the show. And Brad is one of the, again, like I said, IDP content creators for Roto Heat, and he was kind enough to actually pick an IDP player. But he's a big name that even non-IDP players that pay attention to the NFL will have heard of, Jamal Adams. So it's a little background for those of you that don't know. He was the number 6 pick in 2017 by the Jets. He was out of LSU, and he was later traded in mid-July of 2020, so coming up on 2 years ago, to the Seattle Seahawks. It was him and a 4th rounder for a Bradley McDougald and a 1st-round pick, I believe is what it was. So he's been on the Jets for 2020 and the 2021 season, and now going into 2022. So, Brad, what are your thoughts about Jamal Adams, and how are you viewing him going into this season?
It seems as though the community as a whole is more down on him, and I get it. Some of it was he missed a few games. He only played in 12 games last year. But the real big difference between last year and any of his previous seasons is the sack total. I mean, he had 0 sacks with Seattle last year, which was a far cry from the year before when he actually had his career high. I think he had like 9 or 10 sacks. So I think people are sleeping on him a little bit. It's hard to sleep on a guy who's already arrived, but when you look at things like Roto Heat scoring that we tend to look at, he was like safety in the 30s. I think he was 34 when it comes to safety. So the thing I want to remind people and want to make sure people know is that this guy is a guy that is going to bounce back. The team is not going to have him with 0 sacks again. Now his tackle numbers were up. I think he still had in the 80s. I think he had 87 tackles. So this is a guy that if I'm looking for safety help, this is a guy that I've actively targeted this offseason because people are selling him at a bit of a discount. I mean, I've only acquired him in 2 leagues, but in those leagues, I didn't have to pay much for him just because he has fallen out of favor with the fantasy community. He just isn't getting the same type of bump as some of these rookies, the Kyle Hamiltons and Petries and guys like that. So I want to remind people that this is a player that you can very much have on your roster and use probably as a weekly starter in most cases because he's going to get you tackles. There's going to be some pass deflections. There's going to be some sack opportunities because when you look at his grading, he grades out well close to the line. He grades out well, when you have him in the back 7. This is a guy that this team can use in many different ways. And the defense is getting better. Jordan Brooks obviously took a step last year. The defensive line has added some help. And this defense is going to be on the field a lot, quite honestly. Whether you're starting Geno Smith, whether you're starting Drew Lock, this team's going to need to lean on the run, which is going to be led by rookie and young running backs that are injured often, like Rashad Penny. So the defense could be on the field for a significant amount of time. So give me Jamal Adams. Let me have all the Jamal Adams I can get.
His defensive scheme that he's playing in isn't going to be any different than his time that he's been there in Seattle. They do have a different defensive coordinator. So they have Clint Hurt as their defensive coordinator, which is his first year doing that. But he's been the defensive line coach with them and like an assistant head coach even like since 2017. So he's been with the team for a while. It's the same sort of scheme. There's no change in that. And like you said, when he's on the field, he's getting you points in fantasy football, which is sort of the name of the game. It's just that availability question. To sort of illustrate that, I don't have historical data for Roto Heat scoring. Unfortunately, that's something I'm trying to find on my own to be able to build out. But other sites have it for depending on your scoring system. But Fantasy Pro sort of goes off of a balanced scoring system. They have historical data off of that too. So just as an example, he, like you said, for them, he was DB 46 last year in points, but he only played in like the 12 games. He was number 11 in points per game. So, I mean, that's just a huge jump when you're talking about it. And it's been that way throughout his career. In 2020, he was number 1 in points per game. 2019, he was number 2. 2018, he was number 1. 2017, he was number 24. You know, he was a rookie. He's getting acclimated to the NFL. After his rookie year, he's been almost in the top 10 every year in points per game, which is what you're looking for in fantasy football.
Yeah, he's a player that I think just because he's been in the spotlight for so many years, and because Seattle's a team that people are a little down on in certain aspects just because they're transitioning, I think people are forgetting about him. And if you're looking for safety help, this is a perfect guy to target. Or if you're in a redraft, this is a perfect guy to target maybe a little later than some of those top tier safeties and get a better return on going after it. So I'm all for it. I think he's a strong player. He loves to hit. He's a good tackler. So why not go after a guy that we know can rack up the tackles? I think he had one season where he had like 110 or 115 combined tackles. I mean, so we know the ceiling it can be significantly high for this player. So why not shoot for the ceiling if you're trying to win it?
Yeah, the one thing that I just am curious about, and I think it's what you mentioned about why people are a little down on him. First 2 years, he played in 16 games. 2019, he played in 14 games. 2020, 2021, he played in 12 games.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's playing, he's getting you points. But are we running into a thing where his body's just getting beaten down because of that physical nature of play? Or do you think this is just fluke stuff in terms of those injuries? Because it isn't one reoccurring problem with him.
Yeah, it's been every single season, it's been something different. So, and those are tough. In this case, I would err towards the side of because they're flukes, then I'll give him another chance. But if he keeps missing time, then, you know, you have to think, okay, he may not be the same injury prone, but he's injury prone because something keeps happening. He's playing a very physical position because he likes to play up near the line and get a lot of action behind the line of scrimmage going after the running back. And so, I mean, he's going to take a ton of hits, and not all safeties do that. He's not a ball hawk, although he can get you interceptions. I think he got 2 last year, if I remember.
Yep.
Normally it's 1 or 2. He did get blanked a couple years back, but the big thing for me is those tackles for loss, the sacks, tons of tackles. Those things can really help depending on your league scoring, like we always say.
One of the interesting things that I found about him going over to PFF, and again, PFF isn't the end-all be-all to grading, but it is the best of what we got out there right now to look at. You know, again, rookie year, you can throw that out because it's their first year in the league and most players are adapting and they're not going to be amazing. But 2018, 2019 in the Jets, he was great across the board. Run defense was his lowest rating in the high 70s. It was a 78 something each of 2018 and 2019. And he's like in the high 80s or 90s for everything else. 2020, he goes to Seattle, and that coverage grade just bottoms out. Is that an issue? I don't know if it's an issue of him, or have you seen him be used differently in that sort of Jet scheme compared to what he's doing in Seattle? Because he is playing the same basic position, but are they just fundamentally using him wrong, you think?
You know, there's a couple things that I wonder about with this defense that he's in is the players around him. For his first couple years in Seattle, it wasn't strong up front. They're getting better, but they're not. The front four is definitely not their strong suit. I mean, the linebackers are getting better, and obviously we got a really strong one with Brooks. I wonder if some of it's that because they've used him up more towards the line as a kind of a flex type linebacker where he can rush the passer and things like that. Some of the schematic ways that they're using him could be some of the issue. You know, when you look at, and I do, PFF's good. Obviously, it doesn't tell us fantasy production, but when you look at how they use him, and what they're doing with them, I think his coverage grade's low just because look at Quandre Diggs, look at some of those corners. Those guys are the guys they're typically having go further back where Jamal's coming up and dealing with a lot of that. So I would say, yes, I would agree with you that it's probably more the scheme than the player, but 2 years in a row of really not good coverage grades definitely is something to be concerned about.
The good news is he's not going anywhere. With that contract that he has, he's going to be playing somewhere. They need to have someone back there, and they're paying him. They paid the first round pick for him. But this year, you know, he'd have over 30 million dead cap. If they cut him next year, it's over 21 million dead cap. For redraft purposes, I mean, he's going to be there. He's going to be playing this year. He's going to be playing a lot. Same thing for next year. The dynasty window gets a little interesting after that. You know, again, with his age, he's not an old player by any means. This season, I think he turns 27 in October. He still has age on his side, even for dynasty. Contract-wise, 2024 would be 14 million dead cap and 7 million dead cap the year after, with mid 20 some million. So it's going to be interesting. I think where Seattle's at is really going to play into, all right, is this team going to continue to pay him or not? Because if the team is just stuck down in the gutter, they're probably going to try to either get out from it or trade him themselves. But for our purposes, 2022, 2023, I don't see how he could be going anywhere.
And it wouldn't surprise me if he's one of those type of trade deadline players, not this year, but probably in the next few seasons. If Seattle continues to bottom out and the Drew Lock Geno experiment doesn't work, or maybe if they get Garoppolo or whatever, if this team continues to need to rebuild, Adams would be one of those guys that they would target to move on from because he has value. He's a good football player. From a fantasy perspective, that's the issue you run into is what is this team going to do with him? And then where does he go from here? Safety is one of those positions where you're getting so many good ones that come into the league every year that sooner rather than later, the bottom will fall out for him. But I still expect that to be a couple years out at least. I would like to see him stay in Seattle because I think this team can build around him because he's still young. He's a strong player and he's a high IQ football player. Yes, his coverage grades are not great, but you got to use him more back there to really get those grades up. Stop using him as a linebacker if you don't want him to be a linebacker.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot more of that too. Just players coming into the league. When he came in with the Jets, it was again not a necessity with what they had there at linebacker, and you've seen that continue. But it does make you wonder if he could be better suited to be playing elsewhere on the field, using as a true safety instead of just up in the box more. So looking at our safety rankings over on rotoheat.com, and again, this is more geared towards Dynasty. He comes in at your safety 4. Behind Derwin James, Budda Baker, Kyle Duggar, Jamal Adams would be 4th then. How do you feel about him for redraft? Where are you about pegging him for this year?
Those are Dynasty rankings. For this year, I would still have him as a top 10 safety, but I think you can get him at a cheaper price because people are kind of overlooking him and looking to some of the hot young names. And I would look to target him in the 10 to 15 range when it comes to your safety. So that's probably middle of your draft. Start thinking about taking him there just because he'll overperform his value. I got to think he gets some sacks this year to go with probably 75 to 90 combined tackles, get you some pass deflections, a couple interceptions. He's going to do better than last year. So why not target him as your safety 2 and get safety 1 weeks out of him on a fairly regular basis.
All right. Any final thoughts you have about Jamal Adams and any sort of redraft dynasty leagues? Are you looking to acquire him, sell him?
Not actively look to sell him just because people are overlooking him. I have tried to acquire him. I did get, I don't remember the trade that I made, but I did get 1 share of him recently. It was during rookie draft for, I think it was like a 3rd or 4th pick. It was a later pick, and somebody was just looking to acquire some specific player. It seems harder to get him because some people, depending on the type of league. So know your owners, like we always say, know your league, know your owners. The owners that know IDP are not really in a hurry to move him because they in the same boat. They think he's going to bounce back. Some of those leagues where you have a 50-50 split of guys that aren't entirely comfortable are always going to look for the next hot young name more than they'll look for a guy who's been producing for a few years. So those are the guys that I would target to try to get shares of him from because they'll look at the shiny object and be okay with it. And I'll be fine with Jamal Adams on my team. And Budda Baker, too, coming off the injury. He's another guy I would target, too.
That about wraps it up pretty well. And thanks for bringing him up. It's nice to get some IDP blood to continue in here. We had a long streak of offensive players you had to listen to, but now we got 2 in a row. And we'll see what comes next. But, yeah, Jamal Adams, the talent is there. The situation is there. And I think he's shown that he's going to produce. We don't plan on injuries. I think it's a dangerous game to do. So hopefully he shows back up and proves you right here. We're going to transition ourselves from the football field to the Fortean. But before we do that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in over on YouTube. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications if you want to make sure you get shows like this. You get the Devy Show on Thursdays, which Brad is a host of with Desi. You can also find Brad on the Monday show, the IDP show. And Brad also pinch hits every once in a while on the Tuesday show, Dynasty Heat Seekers. So you can find him over there once in a while. He's a man of many talents, and he's all over the place. But again, make sure you go to rotoheat.com if you want to see any of his articles, you want to look at rankings, anything like that. That's the main hub for all of our information. But moving on to the paranormal portion, Brad, you have experience regarding a haunting you wanted to go over today. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it's I grew up in a city called Westland, Michigan. It's about 25, 30 minutes from downtown Detroit. It's, a pretty busy area, but growing up, and I want to set the stage a little bit. This is going to be a bit of a ghost tale a little bit, but there's a lot of history of kind of paranormal type activity in our area. There is within probably 10, 15 minutes from where I grew up, 10, 15 miles from where I grew up, not minutes. There is a place called Eloise, which used to be a asylum it actually started in the 1800s. I believe it was called Wayne County Poorhouse. And it at one point had over 10,000 people living on this. They called it a city campus at some point because it was just so massive and sprawling. And it was like the first to use outdoor treatments for tuberculosis. And when the tuberculosis plagues were going on and people were struggling with that, it was very at the cutting edge of trying new things to help patients, which we know anybody who knows historical things like that, when you're trying new things with patients, sometimes it gets a little sketchy and you're trying things that get a little teetering on abusive. So this place would try all sorts of different types of experiments to help patients with different kinds of things, whether it was mental illness or TB or any kind of other illnesses. So I grew up very close to this. So growing up, that was something that was very important in our area, is to go check out the asylum and see the spooky stuff that goes on. And so I was always growing up focused on weird things. So we would go to cemeteries with our friends. And as editing the show, I hear other people having very similar types of things going on where they're checking out ghost stuff. And when you see your little blips on the camera and you get excited. And so that was always in the background. But growing up, we had that. But then in my house that I grew up in, so I lived in the same house for 24, 25 years before I moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And growing up, there was always this feeling about things in the house. And sometimes your spidey sense tingles and you don't really know why.
Yep.
And I would wake up. There was a few times, there was at least 4 different times as a younger person. This was probably between the ages of 8 and 14. So not super young, but young enough that early on, I just thought it was, I'm just seeing things. I'm a kid. It's tired. It's late at night. So I'd get up late at night to go to the bathroom. My room was at the end of the hall, and I would have to walk basically the lengths of a room and a half to get to our bathroom. And at the very end of that hall was our dining room kitchen area. So it was all a first floor ranch. And I would come out of my room and I would go to walk to the bathroom, and you're tired. It's late at night, probably somewhere 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. I was a young guy, so I was in bed at a reasonable time. And I would see what looked like a young person. And the first time I saw it, it freaked me out. Went to the bathroom, went back to bed. Second time I saw it, didn't feel so freaked out because I was like, oh, I've seen this before. So it's not anything different to me. So then I walked a little closer instead of going to the bathroom, I just started walking that way. And it looked like a little girl. And that second time, it turned around and looked at me. And at that point, then I went to the bathroom because I was freaky and went back to bed. And the third and fourth times, I tried to get a little closer and tried to take a picture, because back then we had those click, and then you could take it and get it developed. And I did that once, and I did that, and I took it and got it developed. And it was very foggy. So it wasn't blurry. Those cameras most of the time either get overdeveloped and the picture it looks terrible, or it would be blurry because your hands are shaking. This time the picture was crystal clear, but it was just super foggy over at the end of the hall. You couldn't really see and tell what was there. So it was very strange to me. So growing up, you had all these types of things going on around us. And I have stories from friends that look a little different, but that was my personal story. It was very odd, and it didn't seem scary other than the fact that it was just something different. And then I would be going to these asylums and looking at all these other things and getting into this paranormal. And I obviously don't do any of this stuff anymore. It's definitely weird. It's definitely strange. And as I'm watching the show and editing everybody else, I'm like, I'm not alone, because these people are seeing all sorts of stuff like me too. And all sorts of different things are going on. So it's crazy. It's interesting. And I don't quite understand why.
Yeah.
I obviously am a man of faith. So I know that people die. There's something else after. Some of these people are stuck somehow, or there's some other thing that's causing them to have, whether it's apparitions or whatever. So it's cool, but it was super freaky as a younger person, seeing something that you just didn't understand.
How many times have you seen something like that?
So that happened 4 times in that house growing up. That happened, I know for sure, the first time I was 8, because my mom even remembers. I remember waking up the next day and she still remembers the story very vividly. And she would tell me things that she experienced, because this was a ranch. So she was downstairs in the basement and I was upstairs in the far corner room. So she would experience things that were a little bit different. She says that a little bit differently. She's like, well, I've seen something, but I don't really know if it was a little girl or it was whatever it was. So happened once when I was 8, and I remember the last time being 14, 15, somewhere around there. And after that, then I started getting crazy as I got in older teenage years. So I don't remember anything after that.
So did anyone else specifically in your family or the house history, let me back up. That's like 2 different questions. Was there anything in the house history that you know of, like before you all lived there, that would indicate there was a little girl and something happened, or did you never really look into that?
So I did ask. My grandma bought that house because I lived there with my mom, my grandma, and other relatives stayed off and on throughout my growing up. They bought it in the late 70s, and there were 2 different families. So that house had been there it was one of the early 1900s built type houses that were ranch style. And a lot of the houses in that area were built for and quickly raised up for World War II service people that would be leaving out of the area. Their families would be kept there. So there were a few different situations where young girls and their families stayed in and around that area or at that house for periods of time during World War II. So from what I could tell, based on the backtracking that I did as a young person, is that it probably was related to somebody that was World War II era that had passed away, because there were 2 or 3 different families that I remember coming across when looking into it. But other than that, I couldn't pin down exactly because most of them had multiple children. So it could have been any number of things. But a lot of the area around there's even a neighborhood just a couple streets over that was called, I believe we called it Shacktown, because they were quickly built up attached houses for World War II folks, because Michigan was huge in World War II for quickly converting all the automotive industry into tanks and planes and all that stuff. So there was a lot of families in and out in those times, but a lot of that city was built up at that time as well.
And I know you said your mom thought there was like something there too, possibly, but not really sure. But anyone else see any sort of what they deem to be a solid apparition as far as, or is that just unique to you?
No, my grandma had mentioned seeing something. She thought it was an older person with long hair. She's like, it could have been a girl, and I had an aunt that also saw some things in the basement that weren't female specific looking, but saw things, because when you go down, it wasn't a finished basement. So if you've been in unfinished basements, you got your piping and you got all sorts of gnarly looking stuff down there. And the way our basement was, you come down these real creaky stairs, and along the wall we had like washer and dryer. And I'm a drummer, so my drums were on the other side, and there was a room on the other side of the drums, and then just this open space where we had a lot of storage. So at one point, my mom had moved upstairs, and my aunt, I believe it was my aunt that was staying downstairs, she came out, and we had a bunch of boxes, and she's, every time I'd come out of the room, I felt like somebody's looking at me past the boxes. I was like, if you always feel like somebody's watching you, then it's probably you, not them. With all the other little random things we saw, I mean, eventually we all started going, okay, well, let's move all those boxes, and then you won't feel like anyone's staring at you, So it's tough when all those things happen, or when anything happens, people immediately go, okay, well, you're just seeing things. Well,
yeah,
maybe it's possible, but it's wild either way, for sure.
And I know you had mentioned that asylum, that and all the who knows crazy stuff that would have gone on there in its time, not even haunting related, just real life crazy things. Like you said, ethical standards weren't always one the highest or to adhered to at that time, if there were any at all. Did you ever see anything when you're went to one of those places, or any sort of experience with that, or is it just a unique oddity at this point?
Yeah, because it was so close in proximity, when anything weird happened, even in the city close by it, people would always think, oh, it came from the asylum. So not far down the road from the asylum, they built a Kroger and a strip mall of stuff. So the lights would constantly go out at that Kroger at random weird times throughout the day and night. And I had a friend working at the Kroger that was like, it's got to be haunted because the lights are just going out randomly. It's not somebody flipping them off. It's power shuts down, power comes back on. And as you get closer, there were a couple times, and it was most of my life, it was illegal to kind of trespass there, because for a while there, they were going to tear it down and do something else. And then now it's actually been turned into a haunted house, which is comical. But we would park over at the Kroger, or park close by and mosey around a little bit. And you would see odd things. It's an abandoned, for the longest time, it was abandoned. And they had tore down most of the complex, but there was a couple buildings in the front by the road that we're on. You would see lights go on and off and things like that. It was like, wow, there can't be anybody in there flipping lights on and off. It's an abandoned building that's not very safe. They had to do a lot of renovation to make it even able for people to go in for a haunted house. So it was there. You see a lot of freaky stuff, but we were never bold enough to actually go inside the building. I mean, it was more walking around, videotaping, and trying to see if we can see anything crazy from a distance without getting too close. Because it's somebody who used to, when I was a younger guy, used to go walking around graveyards at night trying to see if we see anything crazy. And that place just was, when you went there, you're like, ooh, this is freaky. It just felt freaky being around there.
Yeah, there's places, and sometimes you don't even know why, if you don't know the history or culture of what's going on around there. Sometimes even then you just get that feeling, but definitely your mind just starts to go into overdrive when you're aware of what's going on, and then your senses are telling you, you're like, oh yeah, there's something weird. You get that feeling matching what your mind is telling you. That, yeah, that is just freaky is a great word for it, because it's so hard to describe unless you felt it.
I know, it's wild to think about, and because it's so hard to truly wrap your mind, and there's so many things in our world that are just truly hard to understand. We want to try to rationalize everything, but oftentimes there are things that just happen that we don't really have a good handle on. And so I try not to, especially as I'm watching, and I watch all sorts of different content, but as I'm editing our shows and listening, if you can't understand it and explain it, I can't understand and explain it. So it's super intriguing, but it's also at the same time, like, I try to be respectful, because I'm like, I don't know why I feel this way or why it feels freaky. So I'm just going to respect the process, see if I can figure anything out, and then do a lot of research. I researched the asylum and places in town a lot growing up, and I used it for school reports and did media production in high school and try to make videos and stuff on that so I could dig more into it. And it's super intriguing, but at the end of the day, it comes down to people, and bad things happened or potentially happened to people. And you never know what happened after that. So it's wild to me, but it's definitely an intriguing topic for people to look into. It was originally called Wayne County Poorhouse, and then it was built in somewhere in the mid 1800s, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I looked into it, but the area has been around for a very long time. And there's a ton of unmarked graves if you cross the street, because it goes down Michigan Avenue is the main road that runs through that area, and across the street you can find tons of unmarked graves. I mean, anything you've heard about, I would typically equate to that as well. The weird ways to try to help patients and things, like, absolutely, I would agree. They probably did all sorts of weird tests on people there and tried all sorts of morally
Ambiguous,
bad ways.
at least.
Yeah, ambiguous is a good word for it. So it's wild for sure.
That is crazy. And I hadn't heard of that. I've watched a lot of ghost shows and stuff in my time back in college, mainly when I first got cable, and this stuff was so cool. I never heard of that one. That one's really interesting.
It's been a long time since I had looked into it, but watching the show, it brought back I started having all the feelings and the thoughts. I'm like, oh man, I remember and just like a couple months or a couple episodes back, our friend from California, the Dodgers gentleman, I can't think of his name off the top of my head. Jorge, thank you. Just the way you feel thinking, and the rush of emotions and feelings over it. But for me, it's not a scary thing like his was. Mine's just more adrenaline. It's just the unknown, the freakiness of it. I always found that fascinating for the longest time growing up. I haven't really looked into that stuff in probably 10, 15, 20 years now. It feels like I'm getting old, but it's definitely interesting stuff.
Thank you very much for bringing that up and let me know about it, and coming on to share your story about what you experienced and just the general atmosphere around where you grew up, and also for talking about Jamal Adams. And while we're ending up here, of course I know, but let everyone know where they can find you and all of your work.
You can find me with you every week on rotoheat.com. No. Yeah. So you can find us at rotoheat.com. You can we're on Twitter. I definitely love our Discord and our Facebook communities. So you can go and find all that at rotoheat.com. And as always, hit us up on Twitter. I like to DM and chit chat with people and help them out with fantasy content. I do appreciate, as always, you guys watching this show, showing support by loving and liking and all that stuff. And Kraig, I do appreciate you giving me some time on here. I know I'm probably not the first person on your list, because you got to see me every week.
Oh, I don't mind seeing you at all, Brad. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing your stories, and help just grow this series, which has been a lot of fun to talk to people about football, but then also stuff outside of football.
Absolutely. You got to make it, fantasy is fun, but you got to make it personal as well. You got to connect to people and build the relationships. And how do you do that? You get to know them.
That's right. And speaking of getting to know, thank you for all getting to know us here on Player Normal Activity. That's going to do it for this show. And whether you're interested in Jamal Adams or the Joga, remember that we will have you covered here on Player Normal Activity. Thank you, and we will see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like more great fantasy football content like this, please click the link down below here.